Carbon dioxide is a plant food. It's necessary.
Say that again. Carbon dioxide is what?
It's plant food.
It's plant food.
Yeah. Without it, all plant life, and therefore all life that depends on it,
So if we
would disappear.
decrease the use of carbon dioxide, are we not taking away plant food from the atmosphere?
Carbon dioxide, it isn't smog or smoke. It's what we breathe out and plants breathe in.
Plants use CO2. Therefore, more CO2 is good. It's one of the hardy perennials of climate denialism. Like most generalizations, sooner or later it runs afoul of the real world.
Suffocating heat and smog are not just a health concern in Moscow. The heat wave could mean higher prices for bread worldwide. Russia, the world's third largest exporter of wheat, estimates severe drought and wildfires have already destroyed more than 20% of its wheat crop. Last Thursday, Russian Prime Minister Vladimir Putin imposed a ban on grain exports for at least the rest of the year to prevent an increase in domestic food prices. Dmitry Rilko is a grain analyst at the Institute for Agricultural Studies in Moscow.
Это уже привело к очень серьезному росту цен на муку.
It will lead, and has already led, to a very serious rise of the price of flour, and thus should lead, in a certain period of time, to a rise in the price of bread.
With no end in sight to the worst heat wave since Russia began keeping records, Dmitry Rilko believes the longer-term outlook for winter and spring crops is bleak.
Если дождей не будет, то сев не состоится.
If there are no rains, the winter sowing will not take place.
Carbon dioxide is what?
It's plant food.
It's plant food.
On the 30th of July 2010, Pakistan woke up to a nightmare. Overnight, a deluge of epic proportions had turned the Swat River into a raging torrent that swept away everything in its path. Pakistan has never experienced a monsoon like this, and it's not over yet. At its peak, a year's worth of rain fell in a day, affecting an estimated 14 million men, women and children across the entire country. In many places, the fetid reek of death, life claimed in seconds by the water that seemed unstoppable.
The numbers are staggering. 6 million directly affected by the flooding, 2 million left homeless, 1/5 of the country underwater. And officials are now warning of a long-term disaster, infrastructure wiped out, and 2 years of crops washed away.
Carbon dioxide is what?
It's plant food.
It's plant food.
Downpours had been forecast, but never in the last century here has so much water fallen in such a short period of time. 48 hours of non-stop monsoon rain burst the riverbanks, sending torrents of water that obliterated everything in their path. Towns and villages across the country have been swept away. More than 4 million people have been displaced. 1,600 people have been killed so far, and that number rising as bodies are recovered from the rivers. It's an unprecedented disaster for which Pakistan is ill prepared.
Carbon dioxide is what?
It's plant food.
It's plant food.
The destruction of vast stretches of crops means that the prices of fruit and vegetables are now sky high, even in cities and towns relatively unscathed by the floods.
We think that some of the biggest manifestations of global climate change comes about through extremes in the hydrological cycle, the droughts and the floods. And the reasons are because the extra heating that is available has to go somewhere. Some of it goes into raising temperature. That increases the water holding capacity of the atmosphere, and we end up with more moisture in the atmosphere and more evaporation. And then once that moisture is in the atmosphere, it has to go somewhere, so that when we have a weather system developing, a cloud, a thunderstorm, a big extratropical snowstorm maybe, there's more moisture for it to grab onto, and then it rains harder or it snows harder. We get more extremes of flooding as a consequence of that. And at the same time, in the places where it's not raining, things are drying out, and so we end up with droughts that are more extensive or longer lived.
Very
in snow this past winter, soaked in rain this summer, and we're shattering all sorts of weather records.
So far, 2010 is the wettest year to date on record for Des Moines, with 38.4 inches of precipitation.
National Weather Service meteorologist Jeff Johnson says he's never seen anything like it. He says cooler frontal boundaries are slamming into warm air from the Gulf of Mexico over and over again, triggering the storms right over Iowa. Johnson also says heat plays a role. It's been more than 2 months since the temperature has been below 60 degrees, and heat adds more fuel to create bigger storms.
The U.S. Global Change Research Program recently released a carefully documented assessment of climate change impacts on agriculture in the United States. Many crops do show a positive response to elevated CO2, but warming often negatively affects growth and yields. Higher carbon dioxide levels generally cause plants to grow larger, but this is not necessarily a benefit because they're often less nutritious. In a warming world, extreme events such as heavy downpours and droughts are likely to reduce crop yields. Weeds, diseases, and insect pests benefit from warming, and weeds also benefit from a higher CO2 level. At the same time, widely used pesticides like Roundup are less effective under higher CO2 concentrations. We're already seeing an increase in the number of the very heaviest, most damaging precipitation events, a trend that is expected to intensify over the course of the century.
In June 2008, floods on the Cedar, Illinois, Missouri, and Mississippi rivers left hundreds of thousands of people displaced across the Midwest. This flood was the second 500-year flood in just 15 years and racked up more than $15 billion in damages.
More natural disasters elsewhere. The U.S. Midwest is reinforcing its levees, helping displace locals and cleaning up after the region's worst first floods in 15 years.
It's a fact that warmer air can hold more moisture. In the upper Midwest, the frequency of the most intense rainfall events has increased by 20% since the late 1960s. And the trend is expected to continue. By the end of the century, those big storms that historically only happened once every 20 years in the Midwest will be striking once every 4 to 6 years.
New research published by the National Academy of Science is showing that rice, the most critical staple for billions of the world's people, is especially vulnerable to global warming, for reasons not yet clear. Severe weather events like those this summer always cause a disproportionate amount of damage. A recent climate study from Stanford University suggests that these severe events will become much more frequent and much sooner than previously thought.
And I was surprised to see that the increases were as large as they are in our results over a relatively near-term period over the next 3 decades. I didn't expect to see changes that were this large. We're looking at what has been a very rare event for our common experience becoming a common event in the relatively near-term future.
On the farm, workers are processing what's left of the crops. The summer harvest is usually one of their busiest seasons, but not this time.
Well, the farmers here say that these grain storage silos are normally filled to the ceiling with the harvest, but look at them this year, they're virtually empty. And that's because the drought has had a devastating impact on the harvest.
But the most critical plant life on Earth does not grow from the ground. They float in the sea. The base of the ocean food chain and the source of much of the world's oxygen are tiny phytoplankton like these. And stunning new data published in Nature suggests this critical plant population has plunged almost 40% as the world has warmed, a finding researchers call staggering and disturbing. Thus, while climate deniers successfully target low-information voters with 6th grade reasoning, climate scientists document a fundamental threat to life as we know it on the only planetary home we will ever have.
Carbon dioxide is what?
It's plant food.
It's plant food.